Morning, everyone. It's a quiet group here. Welcome and thank you for coming this morning. I'm Tom Healy. I'm the chair of the Fulbright Foreign Scholarship Board, and it's a real pleasure to be convening this panel on Fulbright in the Americas. This is an exciting time for us to be doing this. Unfortunately, Secretary Kerry was going to be with us this morning and welcome us, and we were twinning this event with his announcement of new funding for the 100,000 strong effort to engage in much more vigorous exchange between the countries of the Americas, United States to Latin America and the Caribbean, and those countries to the United States. The effort really began when the President made a trip to the region in 2011, and Brazil, Mexico, Argentina, a number of countries have made a concerted effort to really advance this exchange, which is critical for us in language sharing and sharing of ideas, research, engagement between what are, in one ways, separate countries, but one region. And that's why we've called this panel Our Neighbors, Our Family, both in terms of Spanish-speaking Americans and people of heritage from Latin America living here, and Americans who live throughout the region. And because of the close connection in trade and ideas and culture, they're so critical to the definition of our country. The Fulbright program has been really a leader in this kind of educational exchange, and we have an extraordinary panel today that's going to talk about, in this effort to greatly expand the outreach and engagement of exchange, what role does Fulbright play in this program? 65 years old. Throughout the Americas, it's in 26 countries. 9 of those are commission countries, which means there's a bilateral trade treaty that set up a commission that each country runs together, so there's an independent commission. And then there are 17 countries where the United States State Department post through the embassies administers the program. About 1,700 people participate each year. 2/3 of those are coming from the region to the United States, and 1/3 are Americans dispersing through the region. Those are numbers we want to increase, and we want those numbers obviously to be kind of beacon and catalyst for a lot of other exchange, because in some way Fulbright stands out as an extraordinary brand and vision through that. I'd like to thank a number of the people who are here. There are a large group of people from the Education and Cultural Affairs Bureau of the State Department that really runs the Fulbright program. I'd just like to single out, since there are so many of those, one person in particular who is the branch chief for the Americas and Western Hemisphere, and that is Jenny Verdiger, who's an extraordinary creative and innovative person who's led great efforts there, and it's been really terrific to have her as a colleague and her help in organizing today. I'm going to turn this right over to Ambassador Gabriel Guerra-Mondragón, and Ambassador Guerra is a Fulbright board member with me. He is a storied member of the foreign policy establishment. He was a foreign service officer for many years who served throughout the Americas, Nicaragua, Mexico, Colombia, and then finally as ambassador under President Clinton in Chile, where he had a habit of antagonizing the Pinochet leftover generals and advocating for human rights and open trade. And Chile's transformation to the country we have now is in no small part happened while he was advocating and strengthening our relations there. Gabriel, the name, is, in many of the world's great religions, a messenger. And he's our messenger to the region, born in Puerto Rico, traveled throughout this effort. He has been the messenger for Fulbright in strengthening the participation of Americans to travel and study in this region and to strengthen the program here from all the scholars joining us. So it's a great honor to have him as a colleague, and he's going to lead us in a great discussion with our 4 panelists, and he'll introduce them. So thank you.
Thank you, Tom. Good morning. Good to be here at the Department of State. As our chairman mentioned, the Fulbright board is composed of 12 members. We're all appointed by President Obama. We divide our board among ourselves, meaning the world. We give roughly about 8,000 scholarships a year. Our principal role is to be the last approvals of the Fulbrighters, either U.S. going outside or foreigners coming inside. And also establishing policies for the board. We thought today that we would, for the first time, at least since this board, that we would dedicate this part of our board meeting that we just concluded to do a study, or not a study, but a discussion about Fulbright in general and the relationships between the U.S. and the region of Latin America and the Caribbean, who right now is the most important in the world. The Europeans were the most, but now the Latin Americans have surpassed the Europeans, and that is, in essence, because 3 of the principal countries in the region, Brazil, Argentina, and Mexico, as well as Colombia, have increased their participation, meaning their government's participation into the Fulbright program. So that has increased the number of both U.S. going to the region and those countries coming to the U.S. So this region is important, obviously our neighbors, and I think we have a very good panel here that represents knowledge about the region. We have 2 former alumni Fulbrighters. To my left, we have Hilda Ochoa, who is a very successful investment banker here in Washington, D.C. She's from Venezuela, and she went to Harvard JFK School and as an alumni, as a Fulbrighter. We also have Dr. Judith Freidenberg. She's from Argentina, but she went to Argentina as a U.S. scholar and now is a professor at the University of Maryland. We also have Dan Restrepo. Dan is from here, born here in D.C. As he told me this morning, I always thought that he was born in Colombia, but he was born here in D.C. But he's Colombian, half Colombian, and he knows the region very well because he was for 4 years at the White House heading the Latin America Caribbean section of the National Security Office at the White House. So he's highly knowledgeable, and even though he looks like 20, he's not 20, he's older. But and wiser. But anyhow, then
you did not say that about Judith and I.
Well, if there's one thing I know about my sisters and my mother, is never to talk about age in front of women. Then Dr. Andrew Selee, he is with the Woodrow Wilson Center. and he was the vice president for programs. And he also served in one of our binational commissions in Mexico. So he's also knowledgeable about our program. So I'm going to stop there. What we want to do is we will intercommunicate with ourselves here for about 40 minutes. And then after that, we're going to open it up to this, questions from the audience. So if I may, I'm going to start with our two former Fulbright members, Hilda. Why don't you sort of tell us, what was the, your impression, the impact that first experience as a young woman when you were suddenly, boom, arrived in Boston?
No, I'm going to go a little earlier than that.
Okay, good. Yeah, why don't we get here?
Yeah, and time me, please. Let
will.
me know when I'm
I
three
will.
and a half minutes into my
Okay.
talk.
I have her watch
So-
here, her swatch watch, so that I can.
The most life-changing, insightful experience to this day that I have gone through in my life is the Fulbright experience. I'm going to take you back to 40 years ago. I had applied to Harvard. I had only applied to Harvard. I did not know you had to apply to many more places than Harvard. I had applied to Harvard, and I figured if I got in, I would find the money. I didn't have the money. My parents didn't have the money. No one I knew had the money. I figured you get into Harvard, you find the money. Got into Harvard, and then started looking for scholarship. Now, I had been working I was divorced and had a kid, and no child support, nothing. Husband AWOL. So I went to every place that could possibly give scholarships, and there were none to be given to me. The private sector didn't have scholarships. The public sector had tons of scholarships, but only for people who had worked in the public sector. And I was now beginning to cry, literally cry. I said, maybe I will turn into a street girl here. There has to be a way in which I raise these funds. And I am a woman who thinks broadly, okay? So there has to be a way. And there was the day in which I had used the cultural attaché at the American embassy to serve as my informant into which were the good schools. Harvard had come at her top. How do I write to them? They had the addresses. There was no email. There was nothing of the sort. There was barely a phone in which in Venezuela didn't work all that well. So she had been my kind of supporting angel through this process. And that day, I was actually going to try and get my I-20. And she was my entry point at the embassy. And as I was there presenting, I burst into tears. I was that stressed out. I said, why are you crying? I said, I thought I'd find the money. I haven't found the money. This was like 2 months before I had to have found the money. And she said, well, I haven't told you yet anything because I wanted it to be a surprise. But I applied on your behalf to a Fulbright scholarship. And I am about to tell you, I was about to tell you 2 years from now, but I think I can 2 days from now, not a year, 2 days from now. But I think I can tell you now that you have been approved for a Fulbright scholarship. And that moment, that another country would have the brilliance, the generosity, and that an officer of that embassy would have had the foresight, without telling me anything, to apply on my behalf. I did not even know there was a Fulbright. That was not one of the doors on which I had touched. So I adored this country from the moment that happened. I adored that woman. I thought this was the most significant human relationship I had found in my life, and to this day, she still is one of the three. The move forward, I was so impressed with the brilliance of a country that would give scholarships to bring other students to study here, where no one else would give them a scholarship, that in 1973, I had been helping the campaign of Carlos Andrés Pérez, the Democratic president. Remember, this was the beginning of the oil crisis in the United States. I had been writing speeches for him, which were brilliant because I was at Harvard. I was the only Venezuelan at Harvard at that time. So I was the only one who could write brilliant global speeches for a local leader. I could talk about the oil crisis, all of that. He wins the elections, and the person, I had never met him, but I liked that party. And the person who was working, his right-hand man, called Gumercindo Rodriguez, I go there in December. I would go there and visit him all the time. He says, Hilda, I said, you know, the country's going to get an enormous amount of money. They were not fully aware of that, by the way. And he says, what should we do with it? I says, I'm sure you'll find many ways to spend it, but the one brilliant idea I have for you is create a massive scholarship program to get as many young Venezuelans as you can out of this mess. Educate them. It doesn't matter whether they're great students, bad students, or mediocre students. If they learn another language, that will be progress for this country. Venezuela was at the time under the threat of Cuban invasions. The universities were nests of communism, populism, anarchism, anything that would be bad for any country to progress. And I said, this is your one chance to really make a difference as a government. Massive scholarship program, get them out of the country. I gave my great dream and my great idea, and I came back to Harvard 6 months later. Venezuela announces that they're going to put in place something called the Fundación Ayacucho to celebrate the victory, the Ayacucho victory, which is the one that ended up liberating the rest of Latin America, Peru in particular. But I never found out if that had been my idea. It didn't matter. It had been done. And I understand there were 50,000 Venezuelans who actually were trained through that scholarship program, some of which have become the most brilliant Venezuelans today because they were trained in exceptionally good universities. Years later, Carlos Andrés Pérez, whom I remind you I had never met, is visiting Washington, D.C. And I never kept my contact with Gumercindo Rodriguez because he developed the reputation for being stealing quite a bit in the administration. So, you know, I kind of kept a distance a bit, you know. So Carlos Andrés Pérez is visiting. He's in exile now. And as a friend of his, one of his cabinet members said, why don't we take him to your farm on the Eastern Shore? I was delighted. And we're sitting down and we're talking. I said, President Pérez, tell me about this because it stayed in my mind. How did you ever think of that Fundación Ayacucho? He said, well, we were looking for things to celebrate the 200 years of the Battle of Ayacucho. And Cindo Olivero said, why don't we create a massive, Gumercindo Rodriguez said, why don't we create a massive scholarship program? And I thought that was a great idea. I went, President, I want you to know it was my idea and it was my dream, and I am so happy. So thanks to Fulbright and thanks to that touching, generous, brilliant gesture of the United States, there have been at least 50,000 other Venezuelans who have been highly educated. Do I have any time?
No.
There was a coda to that. Go ahead.
So, Judy, why don't you give us your side of the story here? Since you were born there, but then you return as a scholar, Fulbright
Right.
scholar.
So I was born in Buenos Aires, Argentina, and studied anthropology there. And at one point came independently to the United States to pursue a PhD. And thought of returning after I finished the PhD, but there was a military dictatorship that prevented me from making career plans in Argentina. So instead, I continued to visit both my family and also get professionally engaged in Argentina. So continued to give lectures and teach courses and so on. And there was a lot of talk among my anthropological colleagues about not only training students in getting anthropological knowledge, but using that knowledge, applying that knowledge for addressing human problems and issues. So, there was one institution that I collaborated with, the Instituto Nacional de Antropología, which submitted a proposal to the Buenos Aires Commission, Fulbright Commission. And so they put up an announcement for somebody who would come teach applied anthropology. I submitted my application, and I was selected. And it was a great experience, particularly because I was able to teach the subject in my mother tongue, in Spanish. And especially because when we start putting issues for discussion later on the table, I'll tell you what I learned from that experience, especially because since I continued to make personal visits to Argentina, the cadre of people that I trained and some others that they told continued to ask me to come back and give them workshops to update them on applied anthropology.
Thank you. So, Andrew, from your perspective at the center and with the knowledge that you have on Mexico, and Mexico being such an important country to us, and one of the most important binational commissions we have, how do you view it from your angle and your experience in Mexico as to how both the U.S. government and the Mexican government are taking or not taking sufficient amount of advantage on the Fulbright program?
Well, thank you, Gabriel. I have been very impressed with Fulbright. I had the pleasure of being on the U.S.-Mexico Fulbright board, COMEXUS, for a number of years. Mexico and the United States are two countries, and I'll say something about larger Latin America at the end, but Mexico and the United States are a nice microcosm of the broader program in the Western Hemisphere. So you have two countries that are deeply integrated with each other and have changed rapidly. Where once, as Alan Riding called it, distant neighbors, didn't really interact with each other. If you go back, 30 years, we interacted the minimum necessary. We've had the last 20, 25 years of rapid interdependence that's grown between these two countries. And that's true in trade, where Mexico was the second destination for U.S. exports. It's true in energy issues. It's true in demographics. 1 in 10 Americans is of Mexican descent. Huge number, vast majority of recent descent, actually, and a majority of Mexican families have someone in the United States or someone that they know personally in the United States. We have border communities that are practically binational metropolitan areas, which is impressive when you see some of the cities like San Diego and Tijuana or El Paso and Juarez that are deeply integrated economically. We have problems of crime that we need to deal with together, and drug addiction that are common challenges. But in many ways, this integration has gone a lot faster in economic terms, in demographic terms, in actually the issues themselves than the understanding. And I like to refer to it, I have a book that I've tentatively titled Intimate Strangers, mostly because it sounds like a romance novel, but also because I think it gets to the notion that we are, anyway, there's an incredible intimacy between Mexico and the United States. I mean, this really is a deeply personal relationship and a deeply interdependent relationship, but at the same time, we don't actually know each other very well. And so one of the things that I think Fulbright does so well is create the social infrastructure that goes with this integration. I mean, the fact that the United States and Mexico actually have to manage a lot of very common issues, and we don't yet have the people who have the deep knowledge of the other country who can do it. And one of the things that Fulbright's been very effective at is actually creating that next generation of people who know the other country and who know what the issues are and who can come back, and whether it's in education or in policy or in culture and the arts or wherever they are in one of the societies, they can actually be key actors in creating the social infrastructure that allows us to manage the interdependence. This, I think, goes beyond Mexico and the United States. I think this is true when you talk about Brazil or Chile or Argentina. It's true of the Western Hemisphere in general, and we've actually had a greater integration with the region than we ever have before, and on much more equal terms than we ever have before. Many of the largest countries particularly, but also some of the smaller ones have grown in confidence, capacity, economic structure. This is a changed relationship from 20 or 30 years ago with the other countries in the hemisphere. And Fulbright, I think, plays a role in creating that social infrastructure. And I think it also plays a role in a couple other things. One is developing the cultural competencies that help the U.S. catch up with what it is today. This is a country where 16% of the population, going on 17%, is of Latin American descent. This is a very large number, and so having the cultural capacities to be able to deal with that, and for Latin American countries, developing the human capital, particularly taking advantage of graduate education. The U.S. has an impressive graduate education, has the best graduate education system in the world still. An impressive system. This is a different question, but it's wonderful that this is actually, many countries like Brazil and Chile are beginning to look at how they can take advantage of this system much more aggressively, Mexico as well. And I think when you look at Fulbright, just to finish, I think there's a few things that stand out as why it's an important program. One is the prestige. It continues to be the most prestigious program, certainly not the only program anymore. Lots of universities have their own exchanges. There are lots of scholarship programs in the United States and in other countries for exchange, but it's certainly the most prestigious still. It is in many countries truly binational, and one of the great things about being on the COMEXUS board was that this was not U.S. Fulbright, it was actually Fulbright Garcia Robles. This was the Mexican and the U.S. government and Mexican-U.S. civil society and Mexican-U.S. business community trying to work together to figure out how you support a truly binational possibility of exchange, and I think this is true in many places, Brazil, Argentina, Chile, Peru, where we have these truly binational groups running what is Fulbright. And finally, I think Fulbright can be a catalyst, probably more than it has been, but I think can continue to play a role as we expand the programs. It's the only program, particularly where it is binational, that can actually convene some of the other groups and try and see how we move forward in a coordinated way, thinking about educational exchange as a central, as they say in Spanish, un eje, no, central, a central pillar of our binational relationships with each other. I mean, building the social infrastructure that allows us to interact between Mexico and the United States, but also Brazil and the United States and Peru and the United States. Develop the social infrastructure that needs to catch up with the real integration we have in the hemisphere.
Thank you. Dan, from your experience at the White House during those 4 years where you were able to see from that sort of privilege perch from the top, the whole region, and the importance, if you look at the demographics, that the percentage of young people in the region is almost, 40%, almost in every country. And with the turmoil that we're seeing in some of those countries for the first time, like in Brazil, some street demonstrations against the government, and we saw that also in Chile, and obviously in Mexico, we always had it, and in Argentina. How do the Fulbright and this educational system somehow, from your perspective, can help this upsurge of young and vibrant persons that are not necessarily content with, they may be in a democratic system, but still they see a lot of inequity and corruption in their respective countries?
I think in several ways. I think you've hit on something that is one of the most important dynamics that is occurring today in the Americas. It's happening around the world, but we'll focus on in the Americas, where you have a new assertive middle class that is demanding much more of its governments than its governments are capable of delivering. And you've seen it touched off by small things like bus fares in Brazil, together with the Confederation Cup and stadium building for the World Cup. You've seen it with students in the streets in Santiago and elsewhere in Chile. You've seen it in one manifestation, Yo Soy el 132 in Mexico. And one of the things that educational exchanges, and I think one of the reasons the president, although I no longer speak on his behalf, but fairly familiar with his thinking on 100,000 Strong in the Americas and the role of educational exchange in the Americas, understands is building that social capital, building the human capital that Andrew was talking about, that builds upon the reality that the Americas, everybody has a hard time figuring out the right label for our relationship with the Americas. It's our home. The third largest the Hispanic origin population in the world lives inside the borders of the United States. The third largest Hispanic origin economy in the world lives in the borders of the United States, after only Brazil and Mexico on both of those counts. It's the third $1 trillion economy among Latinos or Hispanics in the world. But building more connectivity helps bridge a lot of the cultural and social lack of understanding that exists in the region. And Fulbright is an incredible example in building on what Andrew was saying, and again, going back to the president's approach to the Americas of being a good partner. It's a true partnership. When it works best, it is a true partnership where countries are increasingly stepping up, countries and civil societies and private sectors are increasingly stepping up to being that partner. One of the challenges of a partnership agenda in the Americas is finding partners to work with. And some of that is a capacity issue, some of that is a willingness issue in local politics, some of it is a legacy of the past and the complicated relationship the United States has had in the Americas. But Fulbright is a shining example of how this can and should be done. One of the things, Gabriel, you asked us to do is to be somewhat provocative in our comments. So, and the joy of not serving in government means A, I don't have to wear a tie, and B, I can say the following. Going back to 100,000 Strong in the Americas, originally my role on this panel was to tie the previous event together with this event. When the previous event disappeared, that made it a little more challenging. But going back to the president's announcement in Santiago, in a speech in Santiago in March of 2011, of the need to build that human and social capital and connection by increasing the number of U.S. students studying abroad in the Americas to 100,000, and Latin American and Caribbean students from studying here in the United States to 100,000, essentially doubling the numbers. There was, when we thought about this issue within the U.S. government and the policy planning process leading to the trip, there was an enormous amount of resistance, bureaucratic resistance to the idea.
Why?
It was misunderstood, but existing educational programs thought it was a threat. And so there was this, and it's hard to do. That was the other thing. There's the two components, both was this a threat to existing programs like Fulbright and others? And where were we going to get the resources? How were we going to actually do this? It's one of those things that's nice to say, but hard to do. The first part was particularly, I think, interesting and missed the point. Both, this is a cumulative exercise. It is an encompassing exercise of existing exchanges, Fulbright, the university-driven ones, something like Science Without Borders in Brazil, which is in large measure a response to the challenge laid down by the president on that same trip in a conversation he had with President Rousseff. She had a small program of sending STEM students out into the world before she heard the number. And it became a big program very quickly after hearing the 100,000 strong number from the president in their bilateral meeting. And I think what was missed also was, and the particular role I think Fulbright can play here because of its history, because of its success, because it is truly a partnership in the places where it works best, is a best practices for increasing exchanges between the United States and the countries in Latin America. I think one of the things, and the second part was right. I mean, this is not easy to do, as Fulbright has experienced. You live in a volatile world. You live with very changing circumstances and changing levels of government commitment outside the United States and, quite frankly, inside the United States. Right now, we have a president who very much understands the importance of international education. Right? His father was an international student here in the United States. So it was an opportune moment to do it, and I think as what we would have heard today is the progress being made toward implementing and making real the U.S. side of the commitment, which is additional resources being brought to bear for international exchange. That shouldn't be seen as a threat to Fulbright or anybody else who's in the international exchange business. It should be seen as a welcome opening, a welcome opportunity to build those kinds of bridges that are of lasting import for the United States and for the countries in the region. The last point, the Americas, one of the biggest challenges in the Americas today is a lack of competitiveness in the global economy. And there's a whole host of reasons for the lack of competitiveness. But among them is, and this goes to Andrew's point about the capability of U.S. institutions of higher learning to help foster environments of innovation. That is a huge comparative advantage the United States has in the Americas today. It's what the Brazilians and the Mexicans and the Chileans and the Colombians, as they ramp up, that's what they're looking for. They're looking for access to that to help bridge and fill in this innovation gap which is a big part of the competitiveness gap of countries. You only have one country listed in the top 50 of innovation economies in the world, is Chile at 39. If you look at the competitiveness indexes that come out from the World Economic Forum, one just came out, there's 4 countries from the Western Hemisphere in the top 50, and neither of them are Mexico or Brazil, that fall in the 54, 55, or 55, 56 in this year's. So filling that gap is very important for countries of the region, and then building more understanding and capacity of U.S. folks going into the region and living the realities of today's Americas, which are a far cry, quite frankly, from a lot of what gets taught to this day in our institutions of higher learning about the region and about its attitudes and about its views about itself and the United States. So I think there's a lot of real value here that affects the policymaking world when you have greater social and human capital playing in this space.
Well, I think that's a very a very important issue that you just raised, Dan, at the very end. But and I have a question on that to the panel. But our chairman here would like to offer.
Yes, sorry, I just had a brief. No, it's just a housekeeping issue. We are having participants virtually, and they will be preparing to ask some questions in a bit. But just for people online, and if any of you are tweeting and things now, the hashtag is #Fulbright if you're online and interested in asking questions of the panel, or if you want to tweet about some of the things happening here. Thanks.
Thank you. Dan and Hilda, and maybe I think, well, I'd like to open it up here to the panel. You hit something that always bothers me about, especially in Latin America, is the lack of philanthropy, the lack of interest by wealthy companies and wealthy families to contribute to their own good in terms of nonprofit organizations. Something that, of course, is very strong here in the U.S. culturally, but not necessarily happens in Latin America. And I think that may be one of the reasons, among many others, why you are beginning to see this discontent in the streets, especially by the young. And so my question, maybe to all of you in the panel, but Hilda, you that are heavily involved in the private sector, where do you see and why do you think that there is this tremendous lack of interest in the private sector in Latin America, for example, to be much more active in philanthropy and then pushing governments, in this case, their governments? And as you said, you gave the example about you with President Carlos Andrés Pérez, but I mean, I always believe that there should be much more pressure from and giving from the private sector, and there are many areas, but of course we're talking here about higher education. So what do you think this occurs?
I thought a lot about that because I founded the Youth Orchestra of the Americas, which is a training program for high-level musicians across the Americas. And we need to raise scholarships from each of the countries to support their children, their musicians. So I've actually thought a lot about that. I think there are 3 reasons. One is that typically Latin America has suffered from extreme commodity cycles. So it is very hard to build and retain wealth. There are a few families that have built and retained it, but it's a challenge. Unlike the United States economy, which is a lot more diversified, and people can build and retain larger portions of wealth, in Latin America it's a little bit come and go. That's changing, and I think philanthropic giving is beginning to change. So the cyclicality of the economies is a problem. There are no huge wealth that have been created. There are no Rockefellers yet, or no Carnegies, or no Gates at that level that have been created. And those set an example for the rest. But that's beginning to change. Second reason is Latin America gives a lot to charity. There are a lot of people who are very poor and very sick. And there is a great tradition of charitable giving, saving someone from dying or giving them the next meal or some things like that. There is a general perception that people who are talented or born lucky and don't need that much help. I am doing as much as I can to change that perception, because what distinguishes the success of the United States is that we identify, and in Europe and in Asia, we identify highly skilled people and support them, because if you do not support them, they will not reach the heights that they're supposed. If I would not have come to Harvard, I probably would be singing in Morocco at a nightclub. So, because I have a voice, I can sing. So, and the third reason is the governments have not encouraged philanthropic giving. In most countries, it is not tax deductible. In those countries in which foundations have been allowed to be created, the government then tries to control them. And that's Venezuela, Costa Rica. I mean, I know because I've gone through that route to try and create foundations in any one of these countries. So it's a combination of those three things.
Well, we have a couple of more minutes, but I would like to, on this issue, I'd like to have some, some comments from the rest of the panel, please.
I couldn't comment on that. I would like at one point to put some issues.
Look, just very briefly, I think one of the things you're seeing is beginning to see generational change in terms of those families that do have the resources, and there are those who have the resources. If one looks at the list of the world's billionaires, you will find people above Mr. Gates on that list. And so there is some generational change that is starting to take place, I think, as the region globalizes. I think part of this has been a certain insularity that has existed among even the wealthy in the region of not seeing the example and understanding the example of global philanthropy in the United States and elsewhere, and particularly the United States. That is starting to break down, in part because their children were educated here in the United States and have a different perspective on the world, again, going to this point of the importance of this kind of educational opportunity. The other thing that I think is interesting here, and what governments in the region have done, and you see this particularly with Science Without Borders in Brazil, is they have aligned the corporate interest in the sense that you have major economic players who need human capital that does not exist in their economy today. And the government has established a mechanism to help solve that problem, to make them a partner in solving that problem. So they're doing it not out of the goodness of their heart. They're doing this because it is in their narrow and broad economic interest to do so. That is a step along the road to getting a kind of higher functioning part of the economy and the body politic and the national psyche of a country. So I think that's an important step that we've seen really just in the last few years, with Science Without Borders being the best example of that.
Well, you're very true, especially about Brazil. Judy, you wanted to have a point you would like to raise?
But perhaps you have a point.
Just a very quick one. I would say one of the things you are seeing is a huge investment by the private sector in private educational institutions in Latin America. I mean, some countries more than others, but it's one of the areas where the private sector and wealthy individuals have gotten more engaged in philanthropy. And I think there's a huge opportunity for Fulbright. We saw this with COMEXUS, actually, with a number of people in the private sector and wealthy individuals beginning to contribute to international exchange specifically as an extension of what they're already doing in terms of investing in human capital in their countries. And I think that is something, to the extent that the private sector is one of the partners with civil society and with government, I think there's a huge potential to tap there because they're very aware of the needs, particularly in graduate education, often in business and in technology fields and innovation, that they expect for their business. And so they're looking at this as an opportunity as well. And I think that's a way to go in the future.
If this is the right moment, I wanted to provide some ideas or topics for discussions based on my experience, on what my understanding of this wonderful Fulbright binational commissions, Fulbrights in the Americas. One issue that I'm concerned about and would like to hear everybody discuss how to make it better is that of sustainability. Often people like me are chosen to represent the United States and go to, in my case, Argentina and teach a course. But then after I teach the course, that's the end of it. Unless I put my personal resources and interest in furthering the initial contacts made through training students, it stops right there. Often I don't know who preceded me or who will come after me, so that I would encourage, and this is one of 3 points that I wanted to bring for discussion. I would like to encourage the Fulbright program through their national commissions and offices to actually put us all together so that collectively we could even help the U.S. in creating more long-term assessments about the countries and what people in those countries are saying, thinking, perceiving. In my case, I got a teaching Fulbright, and put us together so that we could learn from one another, build on our collective knowledge, provide some service to people in the United States, not only Latinos, but other people, and lecture, give public lectures about what we've learned about these countries. That would also help recruit people who might not perceive that they are academically sound enough to go apply for a Fulbright. Also, think of other mechanisms to involve people, both in the countries that we go to and in the US. Not only this one-time 3 months teaching assignment, for example. I think that would provide, in other words, I'm speaking against myself. I'm encouraging us to make better use of our efforts and to keep us engaged beyond the time that we're asked to serve.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. I think we're reaching, looking here at the watch, that I would like now to open up questions from the audience. I'm sorry, yes?
I'd like to ask one first.
Oh, I'm sorry. The chairman always can ask any question he wants.
So one of the reasons we do these kind of panels on a range of subjects is to look at the policy for Fulbright. And we've talked about dramatic change in the possibility of exchange and whether there are issues of competition, where does the growth happen and such. This is a two-part question. One is, in that dramatic expansion of exchange and development of higher education in the region, should Fulbright grow in size, or should it stay small, highly competitive, and prestigious? For example, if you look at Mexico, Colombia, a number of countries, you look at the top group of ministers and elected officials in those countries, often a majority of them are Fulbright scholars. The question is, should we play a much larger role, change standards? Is that a false choice? Is there a lot of growth potential still at the elite level? How should Fulbright explicitly play a role in an expansion, 100,000 strong and the rest? And then the second part of that is, in answering that, if you were given the role of heading the Fulbright program tomorrow, what's the one recommended change you would implement for the region?
Okay, so would you like to start, Hilda?
Yeah, the answer to the first question is yes to all of the above. What does that mean? Should Fulbright expand? Yes. It's hard to fight for resources, but whatever more resources you can get, you should get them. Should you have more participants in Fulbright? Yes. Should you diminish the value of exceptionalism or excellence or intellectual achievement of the brand? No. Absolutely no. Latin America is a region that needs to begin to believe thoroughly in excellence as the most important ingredient for growth. We don't have enough of the concept of excellence. I'm trying to insert it in the psyche of the people. And Fulbright should continue financing not elites in the sense of high net worth people or people who are already in situations of power, but elites at every level, poor. And we found incredible excellence in the most poor places, in the favelas in Brazil. There is, thank goodness, the Darwinian evolution takes a random shape, and you can find brilliant, dedicated, disciplined people in the poorest of communities. So that you should not give up on. What would I do? Well, that's a tall order because I want to feel fair and grand. I would continue doing a lot of what Fulbright is doing. If you ask me, I don't think we have trained 700 exceptional musicians all over the Americas, and they're transforming the places. We're creating leaders, community leaders. What is so fascinating is that there are right now 150 open positions for musicians between Mexico and Costa Rica that many of the graduates of conservatories in the United States are applying for, because there are no positions for high-level musicians in the United States. That's another discussion. So there is an enormous amount of interchange that I know in the field that I happen to know a lot about, which is highest level musical achievement, that there's a lot, and very cheaply. It would not cost that much to get many of those people to qualify and eventually earn a Fulbright that would allow them to make that transfer.
Andrew.
I would say a couple things on this. I mean, one is I think Fulbright should continue to be prestigious and it should be exclusive, but yes, it should expand. But increasingly, and this is really to join with what Hilda said. Elites, the definition of elite has changed. I mean, no longer, at one point, the capital cities were the breeding ground for national politicians and national business leaders. Increasingly, and this is true in Latin America, it's true in India, it's true in China. Bill Antholis' book, which is out next week on China and India, looking at how regions matter and how states and provinces matter in China and India. But the same is true in Mexico or Brazil. I mean, quite often the future business leaders, the future cultural figures, the future politicians, more than ever are going to come out of regions. They often, and this is the challenge though, because if you go to a regional institution in many of the countries in Latin America, your chance of having good English is less. Your chance of scoring the same on an SAT or a GRE is less. So part of the challenge there is how to create the infrastructure. You may have to think creatively about this for some places. And we had this discussion in COMEXUS a little bit. If you want indigenous applicants, for whom Spanish is a second language and English is a third language in some cases, but it turns out that indigenous regions in some countries really matter and are increasingly politically influential, then you've actually got to figure out how you get people up to speed in English language skills and some of the cultural competencies to go into a U.S. university. So that may change the model a little bit in interesting ways. And the second thing I would say is, Fulbright definitely should expand, and the fact that there is partner governments are putting in money is really helpful, and the fact that the private sector may want to put in money in some countries. I think there's innovative ways of expanding this. There's always a limit to this, and so I think the other place that Fulbright may want to think about going, particularly in some countries, is being a convener and a catalyst, which is no other institution, the University of Nebraska or Harvard or UNAM in Mexico or the University of Buenos Aires are not going to convene the educational exchange institutions to talk about this because it's a piece of what they do. For Fulbright, it is what it does, right? And for the binational boards, it is what they do. And so being the catalyst that convenes the different actors, that looks at who's putting in money where, and thinking strategically about what the needs are for the future, I think Fulbright could play a much bigger role in that, in not only doing its own great work, but helping others to do even better work and creating a real community of people that think about educational exchange as a strategic enterprise.
Thank you.
So, the issue of expansion is something that I understand President Obama has already approved. I mean, we are expanding, right? So, that's not a question for us to address. It's already happening. But I'm not as concerned about numerical growth as about impact and sustainability. I think that in addition to growing numerically, we should look very seriously into expanding and diversifying the mechanisms by which we impart education, not only at universities or research institutes, but how do we get to the grassroots levels and to other regions in the country, and maybe to a region by itself, so that I would have liked to have my Fulbright stay contribute to the Southern Cone, and would have liked to have responded to numerous visits that I got, because the Fulbright Commission in the host country advertises the awardees coming, and anybody can invite that person to lecture. But by the time I was leaving, that's when the invitations were coming. So figure out mechanisms to make better use, so that it's not a 3-month or a 1-month impact, and only among 30 students, but it diversifies and it stays longer beyond the person's stay. That's what I would use if I were president of the Fulbright Commission.
So we will now open the forum, and do we have a microphone that goes around? Oh, I see. Sorry, you have to stand up and go to the microphone and address your question to any one of us. So please state your name and what you do, and ask your question.
Thank you. My name is Dan Erickson. I work here at the State Department. I'm a former Fulbrighter in Mexico, 1998, 1999. I think it's a great program. Really congratulate the Fulbright for pulling this panel together. At the very beginning, Mr. Healy mentioned that the Fulbright's active in 26 countries in the Americas, which made me think right off the bat, well, we're missing a few. And I imagine some of them are the small Caribbean countries, but another one would be Cuba. And in the last few years, there have been some real changes, I think, in the educational space between the United States and Cuba. You have a lot more students who are traveling down there. Recently, the Cuban government lifted migration restrictions on the ability of people to leave, so you have more Cubans able to come up here. And Fulbright isn't really playing it all in that space. And so I was just curious to know your perspectives on whether there are opportunities present today that weren't true 5 or 10 years ago, and how you think about this. And it's open to the panel. Thank you.
Well, Cuba obviously is an important, controversial country in the region, at least from my perspective. It's going to take a while before that really happens, even though this administration has tried to open up the region, I mean, not the region, but the policy between Cuba and the U.S. So I don't know. I mean, I don't know if anyone in the panel, maybe Dan, since you were part of this whole discussion when you were at the White House, but maybe you want to comment on that.
I won't go to the policies and procedures of Fulbright itself because I can't speak to that. The notion of enhanced educational exchange between the United States and Cuba is a good idea. It is administratively much easier today than it was not even 5 or 10 years ago. As of January 2011, you have general licenses for educational purposes, and that makes life a whole lot simpler. There are other things that probably need to be refined to make it work as well as it could. So I think the notion of, and this goes to the broader point I've been making and that all of us have been making, the connectivity that comes from educational exchanges, and quite frankly, educational exchanges in both directions. It'd be good if the Cubans would let folks out to study in the United States and, quite frankly, elsewhere in the region in ways that they have not recently. And by recently, I mean the last 60 years. To be able to enhance that, I think, is a net benefit for the United States, for Cuba, and for the desired end state in Cuba, which is, to sound like the broken record that I've been for a long time, a Cuba where the Cuban people get to decide who's in charge of their own free will. I think it can contribute to that. It doesn't have to be championed that way, but I do think it contributes to that because it creates that greater social and human capital and connectivity.
Thank you. Yes, please.
Hi, my name is Lana Ullman. I had the great honor of being a Fulbright scholar in Chile, where I studied migration affairs, internal migration, and being an immigrant myself and a refugee from the former Soviet Union, I never imagined studying these kinds of issues in South America. So thank you for Fulbright for letting me do that. My question is, I've always wondered about the differences of kind of the programs for when foreign scholars come to the US, they come to obtain a master's degree oftentimes. When US scholars go to Latin America, we primarily either do teaching or we do research. And I wonder if there's a reason for this, but also looking at sustainability issues, the structure that's provided to foreign scholars that come to the US is much greater, I think. They're in an educational institution, they have probably advisors, they do very focused research here, and they take courses. When we go abroad, we're sometimes just out of undergrad, or there's PhD students doing research, and being thrown as an undergrad into a 10-month research opportunity can be very overwhelming. And what happens afterwards, right? What do we do with the research? Do we publish it? Do we share it with others? I did migration affairs, so I was ready to come back and explore and all of that. So I was just very curious about the differences of both sides of Fulbright. Thank you.
This is a good question and a complex question. I'm going to have the chairman, then Jenny.
Jenny, could you come up?
Could you come up and since you, Jennifer.
Jenny Verdiger is the director for Western Hemisphere. She'll answer more of the factual things. I'd like to just answer one part of that also gets to something that Judith was asking about, sustainability and investment longer term in people who have been Fulbright scholars. It's over 300,000 people since the beginning of the program. Probably 2/3 of them are still living and actively engaged in professional cultural life around the world, 155 countries. There are often localized committees and alumni organizations, and the person with the next question runs the alumni program here in the United States, and some of them more active than others. One of the things that we've been seeing in the last 5 years is dramatic transformation of the engagement and breadth of those organizations, partly because of social media. And some of this is just even informal, the ability of Fulbright alumni, whether because of country engagement, field of study, their professional work engagement, some kind of project they're working on, it's possible for people to gather and find each other far more easily than it had been. But it is an ongoing question for us of, in limited resources, how much do you put in giving a new person the next opportunity and feeling you've invested something in a lot of smart, ambitious people, and they'll go on and find other opportunities and make those connections? Or do you spend a lot of funds and efforts to continue to strengthen those relationships? Obviously, we try not to do an either or, and I think we're starting to get much better at the connectedness. But I do think that there is much more opportunity for Fulbright alumni to do that themselves without the government or any commissions driving and spending funds to do that. And I think we rely on those associations and their growth to that. And in fact, the State Department does fund innovation and new efforts that a lot of these groups do to develop their infrastructure and new projects. So that does happen. I would like Jenny to answer some of the specifics about the
Good
program.
morning. Let me try to answer your question. You were a U.S. student going to Chile, right? Okay. Well, the Fulbright program is very diverse. and we don't have a one-size-fits-all type of situation. But let me just say that the way in which our program is structured across the Americas is that in general, our US students go to the region, and they go, as you mentioned, for about 9 months approximately, depending on the type of grant, because you can be a traditional student, you can be an English teaching assistant, so it depends where you are. And you are right that visiting students come to the United States and they engage, for the most part, in degree study programs, whether master level programs or doctorate level programs. That being said, because of this whole issue that we have a huge, diverse and complex structure of programs in the region, we have some countries where our students actually do engage in degree programs, like in Mexico, for example, where they go there for over a year, actually 2 years, to complete a master's. Now, as a US student, when you go to the region, you should have been affiliated to a research institution or a university that should have provided you support, I hope. So I just wanted to kind of give you some answer to your question.
Off you go.
I will be very brief. My name is Steve Riley. As Tom said, I'm the executive director of the Fulbright Association here in the U.S. We are the largest of all of those alumni associations worldwide, of which there's about 70 of us. We're about 6,000 strong. Hilda knows us very well. She was part of our leadership on our national board there for a long time. A lot of what you've talked about, and Judy, you've touched on it quite a bit, is resonating with me because I'm having a lot of conversations with our alumni community. A lot of what we can do in the name of Fulbright, of course, lies in the alumni community and not necessarily in the program itself. Now, Tom and Gabriel and the FSB can put policies and approve grants that will certainly move us in the right direction, whatever that direction may be. But the reality is we have 65 years of alumni totaling 250,000 that are probably still alive and active that are disparate in some regard. There are little silos and pockets of them either at alumni associations here or abroad, but there's so much more we can do with that. So I'm kind of new to my role here this year, but I'm starting to look at all of these technologies and all of those pockets of relationships and areas of interest, not just to the government, but certainly in the private sector. And as a private 501c3, trying to find its way in a community that really hasn't been developed yet. I'm curious what the panel thinks about how we could leverage this large community that I actually have access to, and we're going to continue to build to start to achieve some of what you've already talked about. And I guess I'd like to hear from Tom and Gabriel in terms of how we can keep that connected to the program itself so that that public-private partnership can really help to move us forward a lot in a more accelerated manner.
Well, I ever since at least I was appointed to this board, and I think all the members of the board are in agreement that one of the things we learned fairly quickly when we got appointed was that we thought that the Alumni Association in the U.S. Could be doing much more than what it actually does. And I'm very happy to see that you're now in charge, and from the little that I have been talking with you, I see that someone like you is what was needed. Someone that is aggressive and has a vision and knows how to move. I believe that we have a tremendous wasted opportunity with the thousands of Fulbrighters that we have within the U.S. that we could be using much more effectively. Not only for the benefit of the Fulbright in general, but for example, one of the things that we have and we cannot do legally is to go to Congress. But Fulbrighters and alumni, they can go and lobby on behalf of Fulbright before members of Congress that have, especially those committees that have jurisdiction over the Fulbright program. So and not only I believe that that's the case here in the U.S., but from our experience, in other countries in the world, some alumni are stronger than others. And every time, at least when I visit those commissions, I try to urge the commission the alumni commission to get it stronger. For example, Mexico is a good example of that. Now, Tom, I don't know if you want to add something to that.
Well, let's-
Or anyone, you want anyone
I
to?
think Hilda wants to say.
Hilda, you want to say something on that?
I'll be very brief. I think this is great news for the association to know that they can go lobby in Congress. And from what I remember, very little, I remember there was always a problem trying to get information from the State Department. So for us at the association to even find out who were the Fulbright alumni in other countries was impossible. That ought to change. We don't even have a list of the Fulbright graduates except the ones we have painstakingly tried to put together. So.
I mean, it strikes me that part of the future of Fulbright is, we've always thought of it as a government program, right? And then a government-to-government program increasingly in some countries is actually thinking of it as much more of a public-private partnership in which the governments are the driver that continues to be, which gives it enormous prestige as well. But in which increasingly the alumni and other interested parties, including parts of the private sector and individuals who simply care about education, are really important actors in this. And I think I've seen this in some of the binational commissions, including Mexico, and particularly with Hazel Blackmore as the director now, move in that direction. But I think it's a huge asset, right, which is in terms of funding, but in terms of getting the word out also to other people, in terms of the political. In Mexico was actually fundamental, having former Fulbrighters involved in, why does this matter to, as governments change, was Fulbright matter as a binational program? I think that public-private nexus is the future of Fulbright in a way that it wasn't at the outside. At the outset, it was a government program, and increasingly, I think it's a public-private effort, and that's wonderful.
Yes, please.
My name is Francesca Schlesinger. I'm with George Washington University right up the street, and Fulbright is near and dear to us, of course, because of Senator Fulbright. But I also was a Watson Fellow in Argentina many, many years ago, and I worked for the Institute of International Education, managing the foreign Fulbright program for Latin America through the Institute of International Education in New York. I'm currently with the Office of International Programs and track all of our programs worldwide. So I would like to add a couple of comments and a small question. First, we have the Carlos Slim Scholars Program at GW, and of course there is one entrepreneur in Mexico at least who is contributing great deals of money to bringing Mexican scholars to the U.S. It's a new program, and I'm interested in watching their progress. We have 5 scholars now who are doing very well, and so I'm curious about this idea about where does it go? How do we evaluate it, and what do they do with what they've learned? And secondly, I track all of our international programs across the university, and I find, in answer to some of the questions raised, that former Fulbrighters go on to create linkages, and these linkages become partnerships sometimes, formal partnerships across universities worldwide. So even though I don't have scientific evidence, there's anecdotal evidence that the tradition is continuing and that the connections are important. So I watch those names, I keep track of the list, I report on them across the school. And that has become important. My question is about the sustainability and the continuity and the reach of this type of scholarship program, because what I find is generally that it may not be the intent, but sometimes the more educated, the more privileged students are the ones who hear about Fulbright. So how across Latin America do we reach those scholars who may not have a connection at the embassy, a lovely woman, and I love that story. I'm going to take it back and remember it today in case I see a needy student around. But how do they get there from here? How do they get from the point where they are in their own country? Maybe they're not, they don't have a parent who's educated, they may not have the language ability. How do they get to the next step?
Well, that's a good question. I can just give you from my own personal experience when I was U.S. Ambassador to Chile. I obviously became very interested in the program the minute I arrived. And when I arrived, I perceived that the people that were members of the Binational Commission, I did not think were necessarily doing the correct job, especially because they were not reaching to the level of people that I thought that we needed to go to get, meaning it was very centrically viewed, and they only Santiago, the capital, but not the rest of the country. One. Two, that they were going to, or at least most of the attention was going to the elite universities in Santiago. So I was able to, and sometimes it's one of the nice things to be a U.S. ambassador, is that one has some degree of power to do things. And so I was able to eliminate all of the members of the commission. And we were able to have a new commission of both U.S. and Chileans. And as a requisite to get appointed was that we needed to revamp the commission, which we did. And now we can now see the results in many respects from the Chilean Commission today. That happens to be one of the most active and most varied and most wide in terms of reaching areas that before, there were no members, let's say, from the southern part of Chile where you have the indigenous community, for example, or the northern part of Chile. So I think it behooves, obviously behooves the State Department, but since this really is a grassroots, down-up organization, it really also, one has to push the ambassador plays a major role, and the commissions play a major role. And I think that's one example of how to do it. But Jenny, why do you want to?
Actually, I would like to speak to that, if I may. Diversifying the Fulbright program has been a top priority for us in the Bureau for, I would say, that the last decade. We were very committed to that, and we actually put funds towards that. And the way we do that, at least from our Western Hemisphere branch, is that we every year fund what we call pre-academic English, which allows students who come from less privileged backgrounds, who may not have the necessary level of English that would allow them to take advantage of international education opportunities such as Fulbright, to actually come to the United States for anywhere from 3 to 6 months to undertake English language training so they can be more competitive and be successful. We want to make sure these students are set up for success in their Fulbright experience. So we do that. And we have a dedicated pool of money for that. In addition to that, sometimes we have even funded specialized workshops that target, sorry, I'm a sociologist by training, so I think sometimes I have this sociological language creeping in, but not vulnerable populations, but, we have specialized targeting workshops that try to bring in, let's say, indigenous students from Mexico, for example, or Afro-Caribbeans, or others that partake on a 5-day training so that they get familiarized with U.S. higher education institutions, what it takes for them to be successful and develop the skills that will make them Fulbrightable, so to speak. So we did that for a long time as well. So those are some of the things we do, and we press our commissions and our posts to try to make sure that they recruit the most diverse pool of candidates that they can recruit. We push hard on that.
Okay, thank you for that answer. I have one more question.
Yes, please, thank you very much. My name is Sergio Fernandez. I come from Bolivia. I can also say I have the honor to be a Fulbright grantee. Thank you very much for the opportunity. And my question is regarding the objectives of the program. Since we're talking about creating dialogue and mutual understanding between peoples, I think this gives us the opportunity to exercise the so-called citizen diplomacy, to counter some statements or political frictions between countries. This is the very situation between the Bolivian-U.S. relationship currently, because as you may know, we have now a kind of left-wing radical administration in office, and a set of statements and positions have caused, for example, for USAID not to be present in Bolivia anymore. So there is a possibility that in the future, I hope it doesn't happen, of course, but that both countries break diplomatic relations. Right now we don't have ambassadors, we just have chargé d'affaires. So there is this possibility, and I am concerned about that. I'm really worried because, as I said, it is a way to counter these situations between both countries. So if in the event that Bolivia and the U.S. break diplomatic relations, would there be a possibility and moreover a will of the board of the program to keep this program running in Bolivia? And if yes, which I really hope the answer is, how would you do it?
What? Well, that is a good question, and the short answer is no. If we, as I mentioned before, Fulbright program only exists if there happens to be bilateral relations between our countries, even if sometimes they're tense, as they are right now with Bolivia. Hopefully, we won't get to break relations with Bolivia, but we're not there. I know that we haven't had ambassadors for many years on both sides, but at least we're there, and the Fulbright program exists in Bolivia. But to your question, no. If the relations break, we break. Now we have one question. Yes.
Yes, thank you. I'm Catherine Stearns with the Fulbright board staff, and we're giving voice to our Twitter audience today also. We have several comments from Sarah Ferguson at U.S. Embassy, Panama, who says, I really appreciate this kind of feedback about the Fulbright program. I'm new at Panama Post in charge of this program. In a separate tweet, she adds, I think the Fulbright program should grow because it's sad to receive over 100 applications and to select only 3 or 5. Any comment?
Well, that's always a problem that we all have to confront, especially in these difficult moments where we are in a sequester period, and the budget has been, fortunately for us, we haven't been fully affected by it. We have to see what's going to happen in Congress at the end of this month when it comes to the budget. But that's always a major problem. I mean, how do you allocate resources? But Jenny, do you want to comment on
Yeah, actually, what
Panama?
I would say, on a note of optimism, the region is very successful at raising funds, and actually our region is, I would say, possibly the top or second, perhaps, of the world in terms of its ability to bring in partner government co-shares into the program. So our program has grown tremendously in the last 10 years, in many ways thanks to partner government co-shares. So we're growing. The region is growing in terms of its Fulbright programming, despite our finances right now.
Thank you. We have our last question, please.
Good morning from Mexico. My question is basically, what do you think about increase the Fulbright scholarship? For example, in my country, I walk basically the same way that Hilda walks. I didn't find any other scholarship for law. Even if I am working in the intellectual property field, that basically Mexico said they want to work in this area about innovation, about protect ideas, and all these kind of things. But at the end of the day, the Council of Science and Technology didn't consider this area as an important area to support. So to come here, to live in Washington, I suppose everybody here lives in Washington, with 2 beers here, I can buy 24 in Mexico. So you immediately feel the difference. But Fulbright scholarship is giving us around $25,000 per all the year. But the tuition fees, we are talking about 45, and to living here around this, we are talking about, I don't know, depending where you live in, but more than $10,000 a year, in the metro and all those kind of expensive. So you were talking about to increase the number of people or increase the tuition or increase the scholarship. In my case, I would like to consider to increase the scholarship than the people. But what do you think in specific with this kind of cases for people that we didn't receive other kind of scholarships? Thank you.
Well, that's a good question, and again, that's an issue that always we continuously face, especially knowing that there's some areas of the United States that are more expensive to live than others, than if you live in Tulsa, Oklahoma, or Des Moines, Iowa, than if you live in Washington, D.C., or New York City, even worse. So that's always a problem. But Tom, you want to address that issue?
I would just say it's a great question and a complicated one that we face, and perhaps a good way to thread together all the things that people have been saying, because I think the way we address that better is that the United States government's funding is not going to jump dramatically for Fulbright. The issue we'll face is increasing the participation from other governments and finding private support. And one of the ways that we can make these scholarships go further is if we have tuition reduction from schools that participate in the program, and if we find private support. So we work very hard, the State Department staff does, our partner organizations do, to see how can we wring more blood out of the existing stones of relationships, and then create new opportunities where people didn't think there of ways to participate in Fulbright. So we're constantly expanding that, and we're very well aware of how expensive it is and how much people sacrifice to do the Fulbright, and we're grateful to you for it. And it's more about growing the pie through new partners. So I think maybe.
Well, I think we're unfortunately reaching the end. So I would like to, most important, thank our 4 members of the panel. I do hope that, there is Dan is down there, but the 4 members, I think that, I believe, and I hope you do also, that it showed that we had a very good 4 persons with knowledge and experience in the region and from own personal experience of the program. And I want to thank all of you for being here today. I hope that this was fruitful and interesting, and you learn, as I did, more every day about our Fulbright program. I want to thank our chairman. I want to thank the members of our staff that have been very helpful in putting this up. I want to thank them for their work. So I hope you had a fruitful morning with us, and thank you very much for coming.